Welcome to another episode of the Unbossing Leadership series. Today I have my wonderful, wonderful guest, Lisa Gill from Barcelona, with me today. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's such an honor. I've just read so much about you and by you. And just to give our audience a little bit of context, and then I'll hand it over to you. Lisa has been a co-author of the wonderful book with Karin Tenelius from Tough Leadership Training. The book is titled Moose Heads on the Table and can be translated, I suppose, elephants in the room on the table, so to speak. I've read it. It's a fantastic, also very experience-based book, so you really get a taste of what you can bring to your practice. Lisa is also one of the core trainers at Tough Leadership Training that really contributes to establishing human-centered, decentralized leadership, self-managed organization with what they have coined as adult-to-adult leadership conversations, adult-to-adult relationships at work. And we will hear a lot more about how Tough Leadership Training does that. And welcome, Lisa. I will hand it over to you now and would love to hear, of course, a little bit more about you and your journey. How did you come to be so excited about contributing to this, let's say, teal movement in the background, when we go back also to Frédéric Laloux's groundbreaking book, Reinventing Organizations, and how has that contributed to your journey? Anything that you want to share?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I've been reflecting a lot about my journey because it was last year the 10-year anniversary of the book Reinventing Organizations.
Right.
And it's also about 10 years that I've been working with Tough Leadership Training, and about 10 years since I've been engaging with this movement and with kind of teal or more self-organizing ways of working. So about 10 years ago, I was working in a more traditional leadership and development company. And then I started learning about kind of more radical ideas from conferences that I was going to in London at the time. And I came across Ricardo Semler's book, Maverick. And then, of course, Frédéric Laloux's book came out. So I think I read that in like 2015. And like so many people who read that book, I felt like, oh, wow, this is something I've been longing for. Something else is possible. And at the time in London, there was quite a strong movement that emerged very quickly around the publication of this book. So there was RSA had a community called Reinventing Work that sprung up. And so there were lots of meetups, and I was going to meetups. And people were grappling with, how do we actually apply this? I remember I went to visit my first self-managing company, a company called Matt Black Systems in Bournemouth, that had been practicing self-management for a few years, actually. And that was amazing to go there and meet the people and see, how radical it was in practice. And at the same time, how kind of common sense it seemed. So I felt like, oh, this is it. I've just seen the future. I've seen, something else is possible. And at one of those meetups in London, I then met some key people that kind of have set me on this path, one of which was Dunia Reverter, who I know you've spoken to.
Yes.
And she and I got on with each other straight away, and she invited me and 10 other people to her house in Portugal in January 2016. Because she had back then even this idea of like, okay, if we wait for leaders to become enlightened and change their organizations, it's going to take too long. So let's buy organizations and transform them from the top down. And so I was one of the people that came together. There were 12 of us that weekend. And another one of those people was Karin Tenelius, who you've also spoken to. And she and I decided there in Portugal to write a book together. She had wanted to put down on paper the stories of the organizations that she had transformed going back to the 90s, and was looking for someone to help bring those to life in a book. And I mentioned that I liked writing and that I had done some book coaching. So that was the seed of that. And also, I think 6 of us after that weekend booked a flight to Amsterdam 2 weeks later to go and take the Tough Leadership Training program. And I just fell in love. For me, it was like the missing piece because up to that point I had been mostly focusing on structures and processes. I had had some experience being in a team that adopted holacracy. I had been doing a lot of reading and research about, different structures and processes that need to be in place for self-management. But Karen had, for me, this missing piece of us as human beings, and the mindset shift, and the kind of how we're being and how that needs to shift, the inner shift, if you like, that I had been trying to put my finger on, like, why isn't this working, or there's still something is missing. And so that began my journey with TUF, and I decided to become a trainer. And it takes quite a long time to be a TUF trainer. It's quite hard work. But now I'm happy to say that I spend a lot of time, leading courses around the world with leaders and with people that want to work with less hierarchy and in a more empowering way, you could say, and what that actually means very practically, and helping people to sort of see the parts of them that they can't see, that we all have tendencies and pitfalls, and we all have internalized the old paradigm of working. And it's very difficult to know that without practicing in a safe space and getting feedback and trying something else. So my kind of passion is creating spaces for people to try that out and to transition from one way of being into another, so that then whatever structures and processes you want to experiment with, in my experience, it will go so much better if you start from this foundation of another way of being and another way of relating. So that's in a nutshell my journey and what I'm kind of passionate about.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And I just want to go back. I have so many questions as I listen to you. But when you said, and then you went to this, one of the earliest organizations in Bournemouth that you visited and said, I've just had a glimpse of the future. I just wonder, is there a time in your life where you also experienced, let's say, conventional leadership and kind of saw some dysfunctionalities? And how did that feel? I just wonder if there's also maybe that bridge you can share with us.
Yeah, well, I think, I don't know about you, but when I speak to a lot of people who do this work now or who are in this movement, a lot of us have our kind of traumatic, with a little t, kind of memories of conventional workplaces. And so for me, I had experiences of being an employee and being kept in my box of my job description and wanting to kind of break out of that and get involved in other things. And for me, it always seemed so frustrating that if I wanted to have a voice and influence things, I had to become a manager. Yeah. But to become a manager, I had to tick so many boxes and, climb the ladder and all of this. And then I had this insight that all of the managers I spoke to were miserable too. So I realized, why am I playing this game if they're also miserable? What's the point in this game? And I also had an experience of being in an organization that was quite a small organization, and in the beginning was fairly flat because it was small, and we collaborated and we trusted each other and we did great work. And then I watched over a few years as layers of hierarchy got introduced and the org chart became more and more pyramid shaped. And I just felt this feeling of unfairness, and that this us versus them dynamic growing. And it just, to me, seemed such a shame that we had such a great collaboration before that happened. And then it just became, managers versus everyone else and vice versa. And there was so much waste and so much wasted potential and energy in that, and we did great place to work surveys. And then we never did anything with the results. And there was so much fear and tiptoeing. And, it was just, it was so exhausting. And some colleagues of mine who worked in that organization, now if we meet up years later, it's almost like, I imagine how it must be for members of a cult. When they leave a cult, they get out and they all talk about, oh, remember how it was to be in that, place and how intense it was. And like, oh, I'm so glad we're not there anymore, So we have those war stories almost.
A cult and war stories. Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I've never heard that say, but if we kind of project ourselves into the future and then imagine sitting down and looking back at 2025 and saying, what a cult that was, this hierarchical, pyramid organization way of working. That's an interesting perspective. If I may go back, because that also seems like, how do you actually not just read a book and people are excited and they're all over the world? I remember reading the book and seeing also so many groups and people coming together wanting to do something, but a lot of them have not survived or are not as successful maybe as they had hoped to be. But you flew to Portugal, and so did a few others. What did you guys do during that time, and how come you found that momentum that then led to another commitment, which was to fly to Amsterdam and take the training? I mean, help us understand a little bit so we can learn from that, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've experienced kind of a spectrum of different communities, because that reinventing work community in London I mentioned, the RSA one,
right,
that sort of became quite frustrating, because in the beginning there was lots of energy, but we found that each time we would meet, I think it was monthly, you would get such a turnover of people that you would have to start from scratch each time. And I've spoken to people who've been part of like teal communities or, these kind of things. And that's one of the tricky things. It's like, how do you maintain momentum and energy in a community of practice when you have beginners joining all the time? Some people would join and be like, yeah, I don't even know what teal is. And some people would be like, no, we want to get into the practice of this. And so that community kind of fizzled out. And actually a second community, also called Reinventing Work, emerged, that Mark Edelstein initially kind of set up. And that spread around the world at one point. Was like it was a bit like the TEDx community in a decentralized way, just kind of popped up everywhere. But I think suffered from a similar pattern. And in Portugal, it was interesting because we set up an organization that we called Guincho at the time, named after the beach, Guincho Beach, that we went to. And it didn't end up materializing. We tried, but again, there were many of us coming in and out of that group. But what's lovely is then, what is it now, 8-9 years later, Dunia still had that idea. And then, of course, she set up Chrysos. So I was so happy when I saw that she had found her people and they had finally got that project off the ground. They've bought their first company, they've transformed it, they've got great results, they've just bought their second company. And we actually had a mini reunion, me and Karen, and then another member of that group who showed up not in Portugal, but a little bit later, called Patrick Andrews. We happened to be in Berlin together last week, last weekend. And again, he was one of those people that was in the group, and then sort of like, we kept in touch and we floated around each other. And years later, we met up with him, and he's just released a book, and he's kind of comes from a law background. So he's coming at this movement from another angle of like, how do you set up kind of legal structures and steward ownership and all of, so he's has another piece of the puzzle. And many of people in that group have gone on to do their own kind of different thing, like their own piece of this kind of big tapestry of everyone kind of trying to contribute to a better world of work in their own way. So it's really nice to see and follow people and how they've progressed along the way and what they've ended up doing.
Yeah, fantastic. Yeah, thanks for sharing. For those that have been following the Unbossing Leadership series, you may remember that, yes, I interviewed a few people also from Chrysos, the co-founders, Dunia Viverta and Xavier Costa, and hope to actually catch Javi at some time, but who knows? I know he's very busy, but those three come from the NER approach from the Basque Country in Spain. And then the missing link was, if we really go even more radical, we have to buy the company to begin with so that the transformation has no unnecessary resistance, I suppose, to be implemented. And that's actually also something I'm going to be talking more about with you and also in the future, because I'm hoping to bring that to Germany. So that's the big project for this year, and next year, hopefully launching already something more concrete. I happen to believe that, actually, since that book came out, and everything that has been started, I think now is the time. Now is the time to say, how do we manifest it concrete with small to medium enterprises? For example, my wish is to bring it to the succession crisis in Germany. So small to medium enterprises really do have a need. And the 𝗟 or 𝗃𝗄𝗁 approach actually is a wonderful way to say, why don't you not just sell it for profitability or hand over to your children, who may be excited or may not even be there and ready and willing, but to really bring it to another level. So that's a great offering. But going back to you, I'd like to hear a little bit more about your journey as a trainer in TUF, and when you said there was something that really touched you, that you said that if we do that, and I believe from what I've read and researched and what I heard from you, you become actually quite granular. So that you do during the training, you really almost like go into the head of the people and have them look at themselves more and more in detail to see which way of relating to somebody on my team, again, is me, the parent, and them, the child. It becomes ever so subtle again and again and again. Help us understand what that training looks like and what the main, principles and discoveries are.
Yeah, so the kind of some of the DNA of the training comes from Karen's experiments with helping organizations to work without hierarchy in Sweden. And what she learned very quickly was that people needed to upgrade their communication skills massively. So to be much more open and sort of straightforward with how they communicated, and to have much higher levels of trust. And so she kind of took what she had already developed, a sort of coaching approach, coaching and mindset, which she had sort of pioneered with like thousands of unemployed people during the recession. So she saw that if you wanted to help people tap into their potential, then how you were being was really important. Having a coaching way of being made the difference between them really getting a job or not. If they had been unemployed for like 10 years and it was hopeless, she developed this method of coaching that was really powerful in helping them tap into their capacity and their potential. And it's the same with leadership. If you want to say to a group of people, okay, we're going to work in a self-managing way now. So that means you need to be more responsible, make proposals, decisions. Your way of being is in a way like the biggest obstacle to that happening or not, because people can feel if you trust them or not. People can feel if you relate to them as like fragile or capable. So part of the training is kind of trying to create a kind of lab or gym where people can practice this kind of coaching way of being, which is also like another way we talk about it is from a parent-child dynamic to an adult-to-adult dynamic. So to make that kind of practical or concrete, I was in Paris earlier this week with a group of executives from 20 different countries. So many of them were like, C-suite leaders. And it was they were doing a 5-day program at INSEAD. It was like a kind of like an executive education program in collaborative leadership. And I was asked to come in and do like a short session with them on communication skills. So we practiced one of the kind of 5 conversations that we practice in the TUF training, what we call like a relationship conversation. And in just a short amount of time with them practicing, they had insights about themselves. Like one of the leaders at the back of the room put her hand up and said, I've just realized that I am a solutions machine. So I am constantly going around solving things. And sometimes that's good. And sometimes now I see that's me being a parent. And that's really in the way for other people to solve things. And it's exhausting for me. And I just got that insight about myself. And I want to be more conscious of that now. So she had like this light bulb moment. And then other people in the room, when they were practicing, someone else shared, like, I found that really difficult because I was so attached to being right. And she was sort of a bit embarrassed to admit this, and everyone was laughing. But I said to the room, like, put your hand up if you also found yourself being attached to being right, wanting to convince or argue or persuade. And like 90% of the room put their hand up. So we all have these like versions of being a parent that usually show up like being really fast, being overly responsible, like constantly giving advice and solutions without first, asking if that's what's needed or wanted, And it's not our fault that we do that or that we are in that way. That's the kind of water that we swim in. That's what we've been trained in schools, in workplaces. So really the training is a kind of a gym for strengthening and developing new muscles that are completely different to the kind of parent-child leadership world, and getting just lots and lots of feedback about like, when you had that conversation just now, I felt like you were telling me off, or I felt like you became a bit cold or managerial, or I felt like, you were really fast and impatient and I didn't have any space to think, so people really get some sort of insight into their blind spots. And then with that awareness, it's like, okay, now I can start to open up that gap between stimulus and response and make more choices about how I want to be instead.
Right. So what I'm hearing is it's a lot about creating awareness. Yes. Practicing something. And then as a facilitator, what I often think to myself is, we do exercises, but then really what matters is the debriefing, creating the awareness, right? What you just said, that people are sharing what they had as an insight. So if I imagine kind of zooming out and saying, what are we actually talking about? This water that we swim in, as you just said, kind of saying, this is an outdated way of even conceptualizing and understanding leadership. What is leadership meant to be? So I am here to control in a way, right? But then I don't tell that myself. I don't tell it's control. I would probably find it more appropriate to say, oh, I'm incentivizing, or I even like also in tough leadership, stop motivating your people, because actually that's just a sugar-coated way of saying controlling. Right. And that's kind of reinforcing the parent attitude. And so it's kind of this game, as you said earlier, that we're all playing, even though none of us really enjoy it and we're all miserable. But it's somehow baked into the understanding of that's what gives me status. That's my job, to control other people without pausing long enough. And it sounds like that's what you ask then and invite people to do, without pausing to say, what am I actually doing here? And what is my underlying, in German we say Menschenbild, what is my underlying understanding of human beings per se? Oh, I'm telling myself kind of consciously, unconsciously, that they need to be incentivized. Otherwise they would just either not do the work or do it badly, etc., etc. So these are the things I'm guessing that you're helping to create awareness about. And then, like you said, between the stimulus and effect, having more choice, having more awareness, having more choice. So that's wonderful. And I can say that, I will take the training probably sometime towards the end of this year, the tough leadership training, because I'm very excited about it. And I attended one of the free introductory workshops. I can only recommend that to all of our listeners, actually. It was really fun and enlightening. Me coming in there, I'm a nonviolent communication trainer. I work with executives. I've been doing this for almost 20 years. So I was like, yeah, I pretty much understand this, And then I was doing one of the practices, and Karl-Erik, he came into our breakout room and boom, he caught me. And it was so sobering. I was so grateful. I was so grateful to realize, it's so subtle. It is so subtle. And the energy, the relationship energy that kind of happens when we have relationship conversations that are maybe free from that adult kind of top down is so refreshing. It's so relieving. And so I can only imagine how gratifying that also is for you to be a facilitator, to help that, be brought back into business. So yeah, help us understand a little bit more about your work. So who do you offer this training for, and how can we imagine kind of the flow of the training that kind of get these amazing results?
Yeah, so I would say like the majority of people that come on our trainings, and we have kind of open programs and then we do internal trainings as well. The majority would be more traditionally structured organizations, you could say, like hierarchical organizations, but they have an interest in having more empowering leadership, in having more collaborative teams. You know, maybe they see that like engagement isn't as good as it could be, or they're kind of mired in conflict, or so that's the majority of the people who come on our trainings, is mostly like managers, basically. And then there's maybe like 10-20% of our clients are the more kind of radical organizations that are exploring, you know, self-organization to some extent or another. Mm-hmm. And they're either, you know, they might have been practicing self-management for a number of years and they're missing like the culture piece and the kind of mindset, soft skills piece. Or maybe they're at the beginning of their journey. And so they're wanting to set up their teams for a good kind of foundation to then start to experiment with structures and processes. So it's especially good for, you know, if you have former managers who are no longer people managers or who are no longer, you know, in a kind of hierarchical role. It's good for them to sort of, as like an unlearning camp, like unlearning a lot of the internalized ways of being that they have, right?
Yeah.
Because again, this is what I find is like the 𝗂𝗂𝘁 or the 𝗟𝗂 approach, for example, is very established in terms of you know, the structures and the processes that they introduce, in terms of having, you know, teams of representatives that help make decisions. They have decision-making processes. But again, what they find is often the challenge is, you know, the people who used to be leaders or managers,
right?
You know, how can you support them to unlearn those ways of being so that they don't undermine these new structures and processes? And for everyone else, it's quite scary to suddenly be trusted with making decisions, or, you know, if I have a problem, I can no longer go to my manager and get them to solve it. Suddenly it's on me to solve that. So there was like a kind of comfort and a safety if I was an employee in the traditional structure, right? So I find that it takes more than just permission for people to actually step in. There's this sort of transitional phase where it's really helpful to have a space, like a safe space and a brave space, where they can try out and practice tools and ways of being together and having conversations together that kind of break that hierarchical dynamic in both directions, you know, both top down and bottom up. So in the training, it's kind of primarily around these key conversations. So in what we call our kind of step one program, they're like one-on-one conversations that you would typically have if you were collaborating in team, like a feedback conversation, or, you know, a non-negotiable conversation when there's something that we've decided or agreed and it's not happening. How do you talk about that in an adult-to-adult way? A coaching conversation, an expert conversation where you have expertise and you want to share advice or a solution, but again, not in a top-down way. And then a relationship conversation. So when things break down or when there is something going on between you, how do you talk about that? So people practice these conversations, and all throughout the training, we're also trying to kind of explore this kind of coaching adult-to-adult mindset and way of being, and kind of put words to what is that? When it's happening, what does that look like? And when it's not, what does it look like? And so people, as they're practicing these conversations, realize, for example, in a feedback conversation, they discover, oh, okay, so I become like a caring parent because I sugarcoat or I say a lot of words and my feedback message gets completely lost. It's not like understandable. And that is me relating to them as fragile, and that's not doing them a service. Or at the other end of the scale, maybe I'm like a bit of a critical parent where when I give feedback, I cannot help but couple it with advice. You know, you take too long with your reports. So what you need to do is prioritize this and do that instead. Or I become kind of critical, or that I try to get you to change or correct you or fix you, which is really disempowering. So it's sort of discovering and getting feedback about what's my version of being a parent, and starting to get a glimpse of, oh, wow, if I listen a bit longer, people start to become more responsible because they feel heard, and then they feel more able to step in. Or if I don't talk so much, or I slow down, there's more space for them to become activated. You know, or if I don't give my solutions, they come up with something great, and it's more powerful because it's their solution. So they start to get a glimpse of how else it could be, you know?
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. Those, I think about 5 different solution conversations that you just mentioned, they're all relevant, I can definitely say from my own experience. And so what you describe is very close to my work, actually, interestingly enough, and also in the coaching program that I offer. It's a 1-year program where a lot of this unlearning and aha effect happen for my participants, because they're mostly leaders and people from HR, etc. And what I often realize is that there is this, when I come to explore these things, or my clients, the leaders, there's something that is coming up that is almost feeling like it's disempowering to me, because I'm so identified with that parent role that when I don't do that, there is a void that feels extremely scary, and it feels almost too easy. I have to work harder, whether it's preparing and having, you know, examples for the things that are critical, and the advice and all this knowing. It's kind of ingrained that I have to work hard, and that it's me who's kind of one step ahead of the other person. I have to be smarter. I have to be the knower, you know, the advice giver. And when I don't do all of these things, that's a scary place, right? Because it means also disidentifying with something that gave me an identity, something to be proud of, etc. And when that is deconstructed, and then the coaching stance comes in, before it starts to feel good, it actually tends to feel really scary. Like, I remember one man who participated in the program, and he told me months after he finished the program, he said, "Marion, some of my team member, he was actually, well, I won't go into that. He said, they told me now that they actually liked me better before, when I gave them direction, when I gave them my expertise, when I gave them my advice. They liked me so much better before." And he shared with me, for a moment, I felt like, oh my God, you know, really insecure. Like, have I done something wrong? Is this a weak way to lead? Is this the wrong way to lead? And I should go back to how I did it before. And he caught himself very quickly and said, nah, there's no way I can go back now. And of course, he can still be that advice giving, whatever, but, you know, do it situationally when it's asked for. You know? So if you have a clear mandate to give advice, well, then you can, you know. But most of the time, when you want collaboration to increase, then that's actually getting in the way. I totally agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. I just want to comment briefly on that, because, I mean, that's why our training is called tough. It's not because the kind of leadership that we're advocating is tough. It's tough to shift your mindset. It's tough to shift your way of being. And I see that so often, that people get almost like a mini identity crisis.
Yes.
Like, what is my worth then? What is my value if I'm not offering solutions or advice? Like, I don't get that same dopamine hit in a conversation. And that's very confronting. And it can feel kind of unfair and uncomfortable, that so all these skills that I've been building my whole life, I've been promoted for, I've been praised for, are now the very things that are in the way for me to be an empowering leader.
Yes.
Like, that's unfair.
It's exactly.
I don't want it to be that way. And also, yeah, I've experienced that, where people say, people at first won't like that version of you in many cases, because it was more comfortable for them before as well. You know, you're kind of putting more responsibility with them. And when people have been trained to be kind of helpless and passive and rely on you, it's going to be uncomfortable, and they're not going to want that in the beginning because they haven't had to do that before.
Yeah, and I'm also seeing the tension. Like, I can go to your training or in my coaching program, wherever you discover this new way of being, the coaching way of being, as you call it. When I bring that back to an organization that functions differently and where not everybody else has also participated in the training, that's also a big challenge, right? So how do I keep that discovery not just in the back of my mind or something that theoretically I could bring to the table, but that I actually really make a choice, even though I may not be experiencing that with my manager or when I look to top management. That's often what my clients say. You know, it's such inauthenticity at the top management level where they tell us to do this training, but they don't role model that for us. So I think that's another challenge often. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
So I'd like to go a little bit into, if you don't mind, to those 20% of your clients, so to speak, that come, I think, from the 𝗟𝗃 group of organizations that share that 𝗟𝗃 operating model, the self-management that's highly structured with, you know, how do we make decisions and the circles, etc., and how you inject your work there and how that is flourishing and helping to keep the new operating system in place.
Yeah. So some organizations that we work with, as I said, have perhaps been exploring self-management for a while, for a few years. They have some established kind of structures, processes, practices. And we've also collaborated a little bit with some 𝗟𝗃 organizations and also with Indira, the company that 𝗃𝗄𝗁 has bought and transformed in Seville.
Right.
So in the kind of 𝗃𝗄𝗁 or 𝗟𝗃 approach, it can be particularly relevant for the people who work in what's called like their kind of caring team, because they're mainly dealing with the culture side of things. So when people are having conflicts or when people are wanting to have more of a feedback culture, but they don't know how to do that, then our training is a very good companion piece. Or what I find is like a lot of self-managing companies that we work with, they tend to be fairly small, like organizations, SMEs. And let's say, for example, you know, they've been practicing decentralized decision-making processes. So maybe they're experimenting with the advice process or consent-based decisions. So much more participatory, decentralized ways of making decisions. And they're following these processes by the book. And they are struggling, like, why are decision-making processes painful? You know, maybe why are they taking so long? Maybe in the advice process, like, you know, we had a couple of individuals who've made really unsound decisions. They didn't go and get advice from the people that they should have. You know, what do you do then? Because you can't like suddenly intervene top down and say, no, I reverse that decision, or now you're not allowed to do that. So how do you deal with that? Or in a consent-based decision process, you might have either a group of people where everyone is sort of polite and nobody is really raising objections, or maybe people have kind of checked out a bit of the process. And then there isn't much buy-in to those decisions. Or again, you might have a consent-based decision where a founder or a former manager doesn't like the direction it's going, and maybe they add something, you know, if it's asynchronous, maybe they type a message that's so strong that it scares away the other members and they go, oh, okay, never mind, I'm not getting involved in this. Or in a live dialogue, it's so strong that it influences the group, and so they end up undermining, you know, the collective decision-making process. So in all of these cases, it's like the metaphor we talk about a lot in TOUGH is like apps and operating system. So we can install these new apps, like decision-making processes, the kind of 𝗟𝗃 or the 𝗃𝗄𝗁 structure. But if we don't also upgrade the operating system, our mindset, how we're being, and also some key abilities, then those apps will not work, or they'll be full of bugs. So the TOUGH training and the kind of TOUGH methodologies supports all of that stuff because it helps you do things like put the elephant in the room or the moose head on the table. So it helps people develop the abilities needed to kind of break through the glass of false politeness, or to talk about a dynamic that's happening. Like, hey, we have these people who are really passionate about self-management and people who are really skeptical. And then we form this like us versus them battle all the time. And it takes a lot of energy, and like it becomes controversial to even say the word self-management. So, and I've worked with several organizations where that's the case. It's like Voldemort. We must not say the word self-management. So it's like, again, it's like, so we offer this kind of this piece that can be very helpful in training people and helping people practice. Okay, how can we name that? How can we put words to that? How can we become aware of that, get a shared picture of that, so that we can shift it and become responsible for shifting it? So a lot of what we do besides training is also what we call collaboration coaching. So we shift climates in teams by coaching them to talk to each other in a different way, basically.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, how so much of what we do and call work and collaboration is about how do we relate to each other. The relational aspect, and when we bring it down, that's really what it is. How do I find it in me to address a group of people, or most often one specific person that I'm so afraid, I won't admit it to myself that is the main challenge I have, but that's often what it is. Yeah. In my work, I wanted to go one for the listeners, maybe what you were speaking about, the tools and practices are from Sociocracy as 3.0, right? I was trained in that too. And I believe that's often what's brought into, at least in the Chrysos way of working. So the consent decision making, and it's not just 3.0, it's sociocracy in general, and maybe also in other approaches like holacracy and others. And that decision-making process is really challenging and requires quite a bit of maturity to, like you said, for the dynamics that may be in the room, that somebody who's a former leader has, of course, an informal authority still when they are present and in the room, and they really have to manage their voice and how they contribute so that they don't get in the way. And the final understanding also that a proposal needs objections.
Yeah.
And we're not used to that. So for the audience that's maybe familiar with that consent decision-making process, that shift for people to actually understand, now it's my job to really think through and come up with intelligent objections. And this is not seen as critical, but as a relevant contribution. It takes a lot of mind shift going on there to help that happen. And good experiences that help me actually reset my nervous system that says, oh, it was safe to do that. Oh, it was safe again to do that. Oh, I've seen colleagues do that and they are safe. So, it's an iterative process, I think, of maturation also. It's not just coming with good results and good decisions. It's every decision-making process helps me mature and become more and more of an adult, right?
Exactly. And it's kind of a subtle balance too, because if I'm too hesitant or polite to bring up an objection, then the team misses out on what could have been valuable information. And by the other token, if I object out of personal preference, that's also not really in service of the team. So it's to get this balance, which you're right, takes some maturity of like, how can I hold responsibility for myself and, my needs or my views, and the team or the whole, like what does the team need? What does the organization need? So it's this kind of mindset shift from range of preference to range of tolerance. And this whole safe enough to try, good enough for now. So it's this fine balance between not like objecting for the sake of objecting, but qualifying it. Would it harm us or move us backwards to do this, so that we bias for action? And at the same time, seeing objections as like crucial information to integrate in order to improve a proposal. So it's like, and each of us will struggle with one side of the polarity. For me, I'm a people pleaser. So I have to practice daring to speak up. And for someone else, it might be daring to listen and be curious a little longer, or checking in with myself. is this just my preference, or is this really an objection because it would move us backwards or harm us?
Exactly. Yeah. And I like that I bring that into my trainings as well, the artful participation, what that actually looks like, as a poster on the wall. And like you said, is it good enough for now and safe enough to try, so that we don't go for the perfection, which often gets us stuck. And I'm guessing that when you speak about the coaching way of being, in my understanding also, it's about, when I understand how, and how this can bring me more to an adult to adult way of communicating and being with each other, it's to understand that let's say my misconception of leadership, where I have to be an adult, etc., where I feel like I have to control, etc., it's something that has me. And for me to overcome and unlearn that and try something new, I kind of have to make whatever has me, I have to make it an object. So it's this famous subject-object relationship, right? So instead of me having it having me in its control, I have this pattern, and I can look at it and I can relate to it and say, ha, here you are again, trying to dominate the way I communicate with my dear colleague right here, right now, and then making a fresh choice. And that's a huge developmental step, ego development, right? To see, how do we come from it having me and I'm having it. It sounds so easy when I say it like this, but it takes rigorous work. And I understand that your training, the tough training, actually focuses on that. So I also want to, please.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say, like, in case it sounds, sometimes I think when we have conversations like this, it can maybe occur to people listening, like, what we're asking for is for people to be like Yoda and be really zen. And really, I think what it is like taking responsibility for my pitfalls. And like you said, it's like me having my pitfalls instead of them having me. And part of that might be me saying, like, naming it in a meeting, So as you know, I have this pitfall of like becoming a bit controlling. So I have this impulse now to want to do this.
Very good.
But I'm going to hold that back. And instead, what I want to choose is that, so I'm sort of narrating in a way.
Yes.
And that means that it's much easier for me. I don't have to be perfect. I don't have to have it together all the time. And we in Tough, some of us have been practicing this stuff for 20 years, and we still have arguments and disagreements in our team meetings. But what is really lovely is that many of us can catch ourselves in the moment and say, like, okay, that's me being in my pitfall, or I'm being reactive now, so let me choose something. Or if not, we have these kind of social norms and collective practices for cleaning it up. Then we would have a Pebbles conversation or a Moosehead conversation where we would say, so, when you did that, that affected me, and it's like affected our relationship. So I want to talk to you about that, so we can like restore the trust in our relationship now. And we're all practiced enough in that and responsible enough to sort of do that, even though it always takes courage and it's always a bit uncomfortable,
Yeah, it is, because it's a deep conditioning, I suppose.
Yeah.
We fear rejection and the
Sure.
pain that comes with it. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And I wonder if you want to also speak just a little bit, since I'm looking at the time. We have enough time for sure, but I would like to also hear a little bit about your podcast, because you've been hosting the Leadermorphosis podcast. You've had some amazing visitors, and would you share a little bit about how did you have that idea? When did that come into being, and what are you hoping to contribute to with the podcast?
Yeah. So Karen and I had the idea to set up the podcast. I think we set it up in 2017. And the main reason was that we wanted to share stories and examples of what this looks like in practice, and also kind of warts and all stories, not just the heroic, hero's journey story and like all the kind of shiny PR version, but actually like the kind of reality of what this takes and the ups and downs of this kind of process. And so I've interviewed, I think there's 96 episodes.
Wow.
And it's been a mix of like, some of my heroes and authors like Frederick Laloux, Mickey Cashtan, Margaret Heffernan, Margaret Wheatley, and then also kind of practitioners, maybe founders of companies or people working in organizations that have made the transition to a self-managing company. And And also I really wanted to share stories from different parts of the world and from different sectors, not only kind of Eurocentric. So
Very good.
I've had some amazing conversations like about the teal movement in Japan, or, you know, a self-organized social enterprise academy in Uganda, or a self-managing company in India or Australia, or, you know, like all over the place, to see like different examples. There's no one way of doing this, of course. But having had all of these conversations, there are some common threads around the kind of vulnerability and commitment and courage that it takes. So there are some really beautiful stories of, especially I find the most touching kind of founders or CEOs who have like, really had quite a sort of spiritual journey almost through it, you know, where they've realized, oh, okay, there was like a dark night of the soul where they had to let go of the ego or the control or something. And then from there, things started to shift. And so it's been really a privilege. I've got to speak to some amazing people.
Yeah, also to some people, I believe that Frédéric Laloux also mentioned in his book, like 𝗍𝗶𝘀 from 𝗏𝗏𝘁, for example. So to me, it's this journey that the movement contributes to making visibility of the success, because it seems like it's regardless of how successful these companies are, and not just because they have fluffy, nice culture where we are nice to each other, but the bottom line increasing. So it should be really interesting to, you know, decision makers, company owners, and investors as well. And somehow it's a little bit more difficult and more slow than at least I would like to see. If you zoom out a little bit and look at, let's say, the last 10 years where you've dedicated your work and your life to this movement and to these practices, what would you say are the main roadblocks?
Yeah, I think there's this organization in the US called the Teal Team, and they do this teal landscape report,
right?
Like an annual report. They've been doing it for a few years, and they tried to kind of map the movement. I think they went back a bit further than 10 years, but it had the way they mapped it, which I kind of agree with. I think, you know, Frederick's book came out in 2014, and then there was this kind of peak of interest. And then we saw even in the mainstream press, like Zappos and Medium and some of these big companies publicly went all in with teal and self-management, and then were publicly criticized, and some of those experiments failed, quote unquote. And there was like a backlash. And then I think it all kind of peaked around 2019, 2020. And then it seemed to dip, I think, because of the pandemic, and a lot of organizations, I guess, went into a kind of survival mode or a scarcity mode. So many flourished. You know, I had a great conversation with one company, Ian Martin Group, that they really tested them and they flourished. They had their best year yet during the pandemic because they mobilized so quickly. But yeah, and then we've seen, like, in some ways in the mainstream, kind of going the other direction with like mandating people to return to the office, and you know, some of these things which can feel really disheartening, like, oh my gosh, we're going in the wrong direction. What's happening now? But I see that that it's picking up again now, and there are signs that things are shifting. I mean, this case of Bayer, the big life sciences company that's exploring dynamic shared ownership, is quite a big signal to the world that this is something to pay attention to. It's very ambitious. Like, it'd be interesting to see how that pans out. And this community, you know, we had Frederick and I collaborated a bit on the illustrated book, and then he asked me if I would help host a kind of party, a 10-year anniversary celebration in October. And we had, like, I think 500 people tuning in live. I think 300 in person, 200 live in different countries, all tuning in, which felt like a really lovely moment to see that there is still a very engaged community in this movement. Yes, it's like a small niche, but you know, you will have found this, that the people in this movement are so generous and so willing to help and learn from each other. And that's the touching thing too about my podcast, that people contact me, say, like, I've reached out to that guest and that guest and that guest, and we've had conversations and shared learnings, and that is really my hope, that we travel together, we learn together, we help each other. And that's worthwhile, even if it remains a very small niche. I think that's worth doing still.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for sharing that and zooming out. And yeah, the pandemic probably was one big element. And just from my limited experience, let's say so far, we have to be very honest that, bringing in self-management, when whatever approach, let's say the 𝗟𝗃 approach or another one, we have to be clear that it's not just all going to be rosy, that there are different phases, and we're going to come up to massive obstacles where we want to give up. And there may be really signs that feel threatening to us, where we feel that's putting us and the organization at danger, at risk. And how do we deal with that? So I'm guessing that's really something that needs to be anticipated and not normalized maybe per se, but to say that's what we're going to be up against. And then there's something on the other side when we make it through. So I wonder if there's also some research out there, but I just wanted to mention that, if we then give up, that would be not understanding that that's kind of part of the process.
Yeah, exactly. And there is some good research happening now, like Mike Lee, who was the one who invited me to INSEAD, and Perttu Salvara, I think his name is, a Finnish researcher. There's a number of people who are really looking at, okay, what does this take? Like, what are the things that you need? What are the things that are difficult? What are the things that don't work so well? Or who are the people that maybe struggle with this? So I agree that I think it's like, let's not paint this as a utopia, because then what happens is people freak out and kill the experiment too soon before it's had a chance to kind of take, bloom. So I think it's really, to share these stories, to support each other in a realistic and practical way, so that we know what to look out for along the way. Yeah,
and maybe last but not least, also there's a somewhat of a discussion out there to say, not everyone is made for this way of working, right? So one way would be to say, what does it take? What does it take to say yes right from the beginning, or to be an early adopter, or for somebody to say, well, I need an experience and then I'll make up my mind. And then there are some people who might say from the beginning, no, that's not for me. So what does that then mean? How do you work with that? Is that something where you hope that people turn around and see after a while and then kind of gain their buy-in? Or how do you actually then offer also an option? And that may also be threatening, to say, I'm going to be losing some relevant expertise if I move on with this. I might lose some people, and we have to be ready to accept that. So that's another one, right? And also, I believe also that, going through this will also help, of course, not just educate and participation, but also, again, help the maturity level of, if I become more of an adult to adult kind of collaborator, if I have this coaching way of being, I become more mature in a way. I can shape the organization more. I will bring my intelligence and my perspective more proactively, and innovation, for example, will benefit from that. And at the same time, it's still something that is so unfamiliar to a large group of people that it may also be scary. And so that's also a conversation I think we need to have openly at the beginning. What do we do with people who don't find the courage yet to buy in? What happens?
Yeah. And if it's interesting to your listeners, I published a blog just recently about our self-managing organizations for everyone. And I shared some research that kind of shows who thrives, who struggles, and therefore what are some kind of useful prerequisites when we embark on this. And it's not to say you can't do it if you have, these types of people, but it's like to acknowledge that it will take some more support perhaps, or you might want to like start with something small, not go all in, or so it's just some things to be aware of. So I can share that if that's useful for people.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you. All right, we're coming towards the end of our hour together. Is there anything else that you would like to share and leave our audience with?
I'm just looking at this banner, Unbossing Leadership, which I really love. And I something that I like to say a lot is, bossless but leaderful. That bossless doesn't mean leaderless.
That's right.
It means leaderful, by which I mean it's really about tapping into everyone's leadership, which will be at different levels. It's not to say everyone should be equal, because I think that's a trap too. But really, like, for there to be more leadership, for leadership to flourish and move like water to the places where it's needed. So I think we very often live in these like black and white, either or, but in this kind of more adult to adult world, it's both and. It's like both bossless and leaderful, both, frank and tough and empathetic, it's to embrace both.
Exactly, both and. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lisa, for your generosity and for all that you've shared. You're doing amazing work. I know that. I have a lot to learn from you, and I hope to meet you in person one day soon. All right. All the best. And thanks to the audience, and see you soon again. Bye-bye.
Bye.